Morning, boys and girls. Just at Karl Marx's cemetery in Highgate, London, where Karl Marx, his life ended in 1883.
Mr. Jones runs and running and he's running and running.
So a little bit about Karl Marx. He was born in 1818 in Trier, in the Kingdom of Prussia, which is modern day Germany, on the 5th of May 1818, just at Highgate Cemetery, where he's buried. He was born to Heinrich and Henriette. Heinrich, his dad, was a lawyer. Henriette was from a kind of quite affluent background, so her dad and grandparents were in a business. Both of them were Jewish, non-religious Jewish, but they did convert to Christianity. And Karl Marx himself married Jenny von Westphalen in 1843, up until his death. And collectively they had at least 7 children, or at least Marx had 7 children in his life. So in 1844, exact date, 28th of August, Karl Marx met the German socialist Friedrich Engels, who he'd been a long admirer of, in a Parisian cafe. And in that meeting, Engels convinced the young Marx that the working class would be the agent and instrument of a final revolution in the world, because of how they've been oppressed for centuries and centuries and centuries. Linked to this meeting, in the same year, 1844, Karl Marx published his first major work, which was called the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts. And in this one, he developed the idea of historical materialism. And historical materialism is essentially the idea that the world was changed by the physical and material activities. So, for example, he looked at the whole of humankind and history. So, centuries upon centuries upon centuries ago, thousands of years ago, ancient society was defined by exploitation in terms of slaves and slave masters. And then moving along, you had the feudal system, where kind of serfs and peasants would be exploited by lords, kings, queens of the manor, etc. And then, when Marx lived 200 years ago, was capitalism, and how the proletariat, or the working class, were exploited by the bourgeoisie, or the ruling class. And this was his idea of historical materialism, in terms of wherever materialism or kind of money was involved, or currency, there would always be a form of exploitation. And Marx also looked at the only time in his history when there was no exploitation, and that was in the form of primitive communism, which was kind of like early cavemen, cave women, where the men would go out to hunt and then the women would provide for the communities. And in this way, there was a sharing of resources. And in this form of primitive communism, there was no exploitation. So Marx talks about the difference between the base and the superstructure, which made up society. So the base, otherwise known as the infrastructure, was the economy. And this involved everything in terms of making money. So made up of 2 different things: the means of production and the relations of production, collectively known as the mode of production. So the means of production was relating to everything involved in producing things. So it could be materials such as food, clothing, whatever was made in the factory. The factory the land that the factory was on, and also the workers. And then the relations of production referred to the relationship between the boss, the ruling class boss, the bourgeoisie, and the working class worker, or the proletariat, and how the boss would use this dynamic to exploit, take advantage of the proletariat by making them work long hours, not pay them much at all, kind of below minimum wage, even though there wasn't a minimum wage back then, and get them to work as hard as possible. And by doing that, what they would do is they would create profit, or what we call surplus value, where the wage that they would pay them would be far less than the actual amount of money that they made from each product. So the superstructure shaped the base or the infrastructure or economy. Superstructure consisted of institutions such as the family, education, religion, media, government, etc. And what they would do is they would teach ideas or ruling class ideology or bourgeois ideology to strengthen the economy or base. For example, within the education system, they might teach students to work hard, obey authority, be on time, always meet deadlines. And by doing that, it would mean that the workers would, once they got into a job, work as hard as they could for their bosses. And I put some other examples up here. Another important work called German Ideology was actually published after Marx's death in 1932. And this said that the best form of action in terms of creating a revolution was to appeal to the whole working class rather than individually recruiting member by member. And this was the best way to create a collective conscience or a class consciousness where the workers are aware of being exploited or taken advantage of by their ruling class or bourgeoisie bosses, and then bring about change to society through revolution. Just running through a cycle lane, I hope I don't get in trouble. So, after that meeting with Engels, Marx sat down and wrote what he called a pamphlet with Engels, and it was published in 1848, called the Communist Manifesto. Probably the most important work, along with Das Kapital, of Marx's life. And what this was essentially a kind of blueprint for how the working class could bring about a revolution. And it was published in 1848 at a time when there were actually revolutionary protests across Europe. For example, the French revolted against the monarchy and tried to overthrow the monarchy at this time. So, the Communist Manifesto detailed that the working class or proletariat had been exploited throughout history by the bourgeoisie or the ruling class owners. And the only way out of this was a revolution. I'm going to put a bit more information up here. Some kind of a cycling competition going on just by the side of Highgate ceremony. Better get myself out of this area.
And so, our journey ends where it began, at Highgate Cemetery in London. So Marx moved to London in early June 1849, and then he lived there for the majority of his life. He died in 1883, stateless, which meant that he was not recognised as a citizen of any country. You'll have noticed on his grave it said "Workers of all lands, unite." And here you can see the influence he's had on the Chinese Communist Party, that's in Beijing. And I'll finish this video with the end of the Communist Manifesto. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite. Thank you.
Mr. Jones runs and running and running and running and